There's also been a question of whether there are ethnical and cultural differences in intelligence. Um, some have noticed that there are different technological levels of cultures and have attributed the difference to ethnic or racial differences in intelligence. However, as Diamond points out in his book, Guns, Germs, and Steel, much of a culture's advancement is based on geography. For example, the Australian Aborigines never domesticated animals like cows and sheep and things like that. Not because they didn't have the cognitive ability to do so. The issue they never domesticated animals was because Australia is an island, and when they arrived on the island, they hunted and ate all of the potential herd animals within a few thousand years of arriving on the island. So hence they couldn't domesticate them later on. Another example, Africans did not domesticate and learn to ride zebras because they look like horses, but these animals have a different social organization from horses. They are not trainable as mounts. Um, so those are the animals that were near that culture. It just wasn't a opportunity that they had. It says nothing about their abilities. In fact, Diamond makes the point that he did his studies with some Aboriginal tribes in Tasmania, I believe, and his point was that Westerners would have a really hard time surviving in the really harsh conditions that the Aborigines face, and that what they do is perfectly adapted for them to thrive in a very inhospitable climate. Are there IQ differences? So are the differences, if the differences are not due to genetics, could they be due to the environment? If they were genetic, a purely innate general intelligence should be stable over generations. But it's known that intelligence is not stable. In fact, whenever they've re-standardized major IQ tests between 1932 and 1981, the samples tended to be higher than their predecessors. So in other words, to be considered average compared with people your age, you needed to, say on a vocabulary test, you'd have to get more right to fall in the average range in 1981 than you would have to get right in 1932. So overall, humankind appears to have picked up nearly 14 IQ points in the last century. And this similar observations have been made in other countries using other tests, so it's not just an artifact of one particular test. This is called the Flynn effect, and standardization is shown about 3 IQ points every 10 years increase. Now this may have peaked, but it's not certain yet. There have been a lot of theories for why this Flynn effect has happened. It doesn't seem to be due to nutrition, because even in earlier years when the nutrition wasn't so good, like in the 30s, 40s, they still found the gains. It could be due to, one of the things I think is it might be due to changes in instruction, that in school there's less of an emphasis nowadays on rote learning and more of an emphasis on critical thinking. The other thing they've noticed is that most of the gains in overall IQ seem to happen with the nonverbal IQ abilities. So it appears that the verbal abilities, like defining vocabulary, reasoning with words, has stayed pretty stable, but it's really most of the gains have come from the nonverbal visualization, visual organization side of things. So it may be that more exposure to those types of tasks and changes in instructional practices might have something to do with the impact. In One interesting take on this was by Steve Johnson, who wrote a book called Everything Bad is Good for You. And he says that video games and modern TV actually make people smarter because there are increasingly more cognitive demands and more complexity in these things than there used to be. For example, if you think about, go to Nick at Night and watching an old sitcom like Gilligan's Island, every episode had a simple and repeated premise. They were trying to get off the island. It was always the same characters. It started with kind of a new situation every single time. Now compare a show like Gilligan's Island with a show like The Simpsons. Typically, if you watch an episode of The Simpsons, there are multiple subplots, which means there are 2 or 3 things going on at the same time. There are a lot of characters to keep track of, many characters. There are references to previous episodes, and also you have to have some grounding in a broad range of cultural events, literature, movies, all types of things to get all of the jokes. So you can see that the cognitive requirement for watching a show like that is really a lot more complex. That's also true of dramas like The Sopranos. Johnson would say that even keeping track and following reality type shows requires a lot more just cognitive processing than it used to watch the old shows. Another issue is video games. He would also say that playing video games is another thing that really exercises people's brains. And I can see that. My son is currently playing a game called Portal, which it really involves a lot of problem solving, a lot of visual memory. Like you have to imagine what, something would happen if it came out of a portal on the other side of the room, and you have to do just a lot of like reasoning things out. You have to find your way through pretty complex, a maze kind of setting. So that really calls for a lot of visual memory, reasoning, long-term memory, all kinds of things. So, the games can be quite challenging cognitively. And again, that kind of goes with the idea that a lot of the gains in the Flynn effect have been in those types of nonverbal intelligence. Now, the next question, are group differences due to test bias? I've made up a test here which I think might be a little bit biased. It's a picture of a horse, and it says down below, this is A, a dressage horse, B, a steeplechase horse, or C, a polo pony. A lot of people might not have the exposure to know the correct answer to that particular one. There have been court cases challenging the overrepresentation of minority groups in things like special education, diagnosis, and as a result, there's been a lot more attention paid to eliminating bias in tests. And it is true that on standard IQ tests, a lot of different types of group, difference will show up. For example, males tend to do better on visual spatial tasks. Females tend to do better on verbal tasks. Now you can ask, is this nurture or nature? Maybe males doing better on the visual tasks might be due to more exposure to like playing with Legos or things. Females tend to be superior in quantitative ability until they hit puberty, and then the males do. And that's, that might be something that you would wonder why that is. Now, as far as ethnic groups, African Americans score lower than whites, and there has been a question of bias that's been raised. But this also goes back to some of the environmental factors. For example, if you're going to a school that's not as good, if you don't have as much social support for learning, those could also account for for the differences between the groups. It doesn't necessarily have to be because of genetic differences. And as we've seen, the evidence for genetic differences is not all that good. Well, there are ways to study IQ tests and other types of tests to see if they are in fact biased, and it goes back to validation studies. There are three potential types of bias that you could look for in an IQ test: content validity bias, construct validity bias, predictive validity bias. I have to say that new tests are much more rigorous about checking for item bias before they're published. So one of the reasons might be because they go through this type of study. Now, content validity bias would happen if there were an item or a subscale of the test that's relatively more difficult for members of one group than for members of another group, even though general ability of the two groups is similar. So we'll go back to my horse knowledge slide that I showed you. If you don't have exposure to different types of horse riding or activity, then you could be a perfectly intelligent person, but you would be at a disadvantage against a more horsey type person. The way that you study for this is you can match subjects for overall ability and then look for significant differences in difficulty for certain items. Sometimes they will use panels of reviewers also just to kind of look at face validity types of things. When you look at the studies, it appears that there's little bias in today's test. There's not much, and it's not very systematic. Modern tests really do make an effort to depict a lot of different ethnic groups and really vet those questions. Sometimes they've thought that questions would be biased, but when they tested them out, they found that wasn't the case. For example, on the IQ test, there's a social reasoning task, and one of the questions for kids would be, what would you do if a boy much smaller than yourself starts to fight with you? And of course, the correct answer that they're looking for is, well, you'd walk away. But some people have looked at that question and said, well, if you're in the inner city and somebody messes with you, you have to be tough and you have to show that you're not going to back down from a conflict just so that you have some street credibility. So the answer would be, if anybody messes with you, you give them a smackdown. This was the theory, that this question would be biased, but this was an example of one where they compared the answers of different ethnic groups, and there really was no difference. Just about everybody knew that the correct answer or the expected answer was you would walk away and not fight with them. So, it was suspected to be biased, but investigation showed that it really wasn't. Another type of bias would be construct validity bias, and this would exist if a test were shown to measure different hypothetical traits for one group versus another group. For example, maybe for one group, the verbal IQ task is a measure of how much verbal ability you have, but for another group it might be how much exposure have you had to vocabulary and things like that through your school. One of the ways that you would investigate this would be through using factor analysis, which is a type of correlation where you can see whether different groups or different types of information cluster together. And so you can see whether there are distinct groups that are similar, and are they considerably different from other groups. So to belong to one group, you have to be strongly correlated with the other things in your group, and you have to be negatively correlated with something else. For example, a verbal task, you would expect it to be correlated with the other verbal tasks, but not so correlated with nonverbal tasks. Well, again, when they did this type of analysis, what they found was there's a great deal of similarity in factor structures across all groups. So it does seem that the construct of intelligence is the same for different groups. Another type of bias would be predictive validity bias, and here, this would be where you look at the predictive power of IQ tests across different groups. And most of these investigations have looked at prediction of academic success or failure in school. And the Wechsler test seems to predict school achievement equally well for Caucasian, African American, and Hispanic kids. So it really does seem that modern tests are fairly free of a lot of bias. So a conclusion to the IQ controversy. These are some things that I think can be concluded. One is that differences in scores are not due to bias in test construction or administration. There's not a lot of empirical evidence of that. Differences in scores are not due to genetic differences. They're not due to they are partly due to socioeconomic class differences. And they can be due to cultural and caste type factors like racism, societal expectations. These things are still being investigated. The American Psychological Association had a task force to look at this controversy, and they did choose to emphasize environmental over genetic factors. So the current thinking is really that environmental factors are the important ones. Although they do suggest that there might be some explanations based on social status and cultural differences. But there's no definitive evidence for the hypothesis that black-white test score gap is a result of genetic differences between the groups. So I think that's pretty much the current thinking. A lot of the social Darwinist types of thinking have been pretty much rejected by most professionals. So here's another question. If the differences are mostly environmental, is it possible to improve IQ scores in individuals? It used to be thought that, well, IQ is pretty innate, it's pretty stable trait, so can you really raise somebody's IQ scores in an individual? And Richard Nisbett, in his book Intelligence and How to Get It, says absolutely it can. And he gives some examples. For example, parenting practices can lead to higher IQ. For example, kids who can learn to delay their gratification tend to do better. They're better learners. So it would be a task. Well, do you want one cookie? Do you want one cookie now, or will you take 2 cookies in 30 minutes? So the kids who say, okay, I'd rather have 2 cookies, I'm willing to wait, they have delayed gratification, and they are more prepared for learning. They don't need to sort of have immediate feedback, immediate satisfaction. Another really important one is, and I think this kind of, probably 20, 25 years ago, our society decided that the most important thing that you can give a child is self-esteem. And as a result of that, I think that there's been a lot of tendency to not want kids to be discouraged and to sort of really build them up so that they feel good about themselves. But I think that in a lot of cases that's kind of led kids to being confused about what do their accomplishments mean. If you praise everything they do, then it kind of loses its meaning, and it also kind of loses, they lose their ability to sort of discriminate between what's something that they've really earned and what's something that, oh, everybody gets a trophy kind of thing. So Nisbet says it's really important that you praise effort rather than ability, and that's another thing that leads to better learners. And that makes sense if you think about it, that if when kids get a right answer, a lot of times adults will say things like, "Oh, you're so smart." But if that's the premise, then what does it mean if you don't get the right answer? If you get the right answer, that means you're smart. If you don't get the right answer, that must mean you're dumb. I think that praising the effort is something that leads to kids being more persistent, and being less discouraged. Asian cultures tend to do this, where the effort you put in, how hard you try, how hard you work, really is given a lot more praise than how much native ability you have. Another way that Nisbet mentions that learning can be improved is, he notes that middle-class parents a lot of times will ask kids questions where they already know the answer. For example, what color is that bird? And that type of questioning, getting kids to sort of think and use their vocabulary and things like that, prepares kids better for school more than cultures who don't do that. So for some kids who've never had exposure to that kind of question, I think their response is, well, you're the teacher and you don't know, so how am I supposed to know? So really engaging kids in that way early on is another way that they can become better learners. And as you can see, all of these types of things are pretty simple to do. In a way, they're tend to be a little bit counterintuitive compared with what we do now, but they really do lead to better outcomes. And it is important to keep in mind, that there are things that can be done fairly easily to make kids better learners and better prepared for school, and hence more intelligent. Some other issues. Intelligence theorist named Robert Sternberg notes that memory and analytic reasoning, applying rules, these are skills that are necessary for doing well in school, and IQ and aptitude tests measure this so-called formal knowledge. However, at work, you need a different kind of knowledge. He calls it tacit knowledge. And tacit knowledge really looks more at what we might call street smarts. It's the information that you need to be successful at your job that goes beyond what you're taught formally. For example, a college professor, you might have, say you have a geography professor who's just a top expert in his field and he knows everything about his field. That by itself is not sufficient for him to be successful as a professor. There are some other tacit knowledge things that you need to be successful as a university professor. One would be, how do you play the politics in the department? Who do you ally yourself with to get ahead? How do you get good course ratings from students? How do you get grants and funding and things like that? So that's all tacit knowledge that they don't teach you in grad school, but you need to know. And every profession has its own set of this tacit knowledge type of information. He developed a test called the Triarchic Abilities Test that's supposed to measure it, but when they've subjected it to the usual types of validity studies, what they find is it's not that different from a Wechsler IQ test, for example. Another interesting issue with the tacit knowledge is there was one study that showed it looked at MCAT scores, and MCAT is the aptitude test you need to take to get into medical school. And one study showed there was actually a negative correlation between MCAT scores and ratings of bedside manner. So the ones who had the really good formal knowledge weren't necessarily the ones who had the more interpersonal skills. This has also been seen with tests of emotional intelligence, which is how empathic are you, how much can you understand other people's point of view, how well can you get across your own feelings and emotions. And tests of emotional intelligence actually do better than, so having high emotional intelligence is a better predictor of success in a work group than having a high IQ type of intelligence. So I'll quickly go through some other types of testing that you might encounter in an educational setting. Achievement testing, unlike IQ testing, which is really considered a relatively stable measure of capacities you have, like memory and language comprehension, things like that. Achievement testing is intended to be more of a description of your current skill level in academics, reading, writing, math, listening, things like that. There are different types. They might be group-administered achievement tests. Counselors are usually pretty involved in administrating and interpreting these to parents, whether it's a college placement test or a kneecap scores or some things like that. New Hampshire is part of a group of states that gives the kneecap assessment, which is used to determine whether students are meeting the state objectives. This is the one that's used in determining No Child Left Behind whether school is considered to be making adequate progress or not. So these are actually tests that kids take, but the stakes for the tests coming out well are higher for the teachers and administrators than they are for the kids. So it's kind of a unique situation. There are also individual tests, achievement tests that might be given diagnostically as part of a special education evaluation. Some of them are broad tests that might look at several different abilities. Some might be more specifically looking at written expression or reading comprehension or those types of things. Now, SATs and GREs are aptitude tests, basically. They're not so much a survey of all of the academic skills you might have, but it's trying to get at, do you have the capacities to be successful in doing college level work? What they found is that with the SATs, they're a better, by themselves, they're not a particularly good predictor. They do better when they're combined with other variables. For example, your high school grades. Different schools put different weights on them depending on how much they're going to be screening out applications. Other types of vocational aptitude tests, there might be some that look at manual dexterity and mechanical aptitude and things like that. The military uses one of these called the ASVAB, which is a fairly good predictor of your military ratings, like what types of military jobs you might be good at. They're probably not a good predictor of college or other types of professions, but they're pretty much geared toward military placement. I got a little ahead of myself here. So there's the aptitude test. Now here's a chart that shows the predictive validity of the SAT tests. So FYG means freshman year GPA. So you're looking at correlations of predictors with a freshman year GPA. So probably the best you can do is there's a 0.54 correlation between your SAT scores, or no, this is between your high school GPA and your freshman year GPA. That by itself is not a super good predictor, but it's better than critical thinking, math, writing, SATs. They get a little bit better if you combine and look at the whole SAT value, plus if you throw in high school GPA and all of the SAT sections, then you can make a prediction of about 0.62 positive correlation in predicting how the students will do with their freshman year grades. Now, if you square correlations coefficients, that will give you the amount of shared variance that the tests have. So when you square this, you find that SAT reading and math by itself only predicts about 10% of the variance in freshman grades at the end of the freshman year. So they're not very good at predicting at all. So you might ask, what is the predictive validity of the GRE? Is it better or worse than the SAT? If you read the technical information, it is terrible. It only accounts for about 3% of the variance in graduate school grades, so it's an even worse predictor than the SAT. Now, another thing that I would mention here would be executive functions. We've looked at the measurement of cognitive ability and also academic achievement. And I think we all know kids that are smart who don't do well in school. We know kids who have pretty good skills who don't do well in school. Executive functions is looking at the capacities that you need to actually use your abilities and your skills together to actually accomplish things and get things done. There are usually two basic components to executive functions. One is the ability to self-regulate, which would include emotional and behavioral control, and also behavioral and emotional flexibility. Can you adapt to different situations? Can you recover from setbacks? Can you control your impulses? Can you control your frustration? Those types of things are important in getting tasks done. And then the other part of it is called metacognitive, and that is things like planning a task, getting started on it, keeping track of what you need to do the task, planning it out, getting it done, maintaining your focus, monitoring how you're doing on the task. All of those types of things are very important. And as I mentioned, a lot of times when we evaluate kids, we find that they have pretty good cognitive ability and pretty good skills often, but we're seeing a lot of issues more with the executive function kinds of things. There are different ways to measure executive function. One might be through a behavior rating, and this would be one where parents or teachers can describe students just the level of these behaviors that they exhibit. For example, if you give them, 3 tasks to do, can they remember them all? Can they get their ideas down on paper? Can they think ahead? Can they relate their, the work that they do with the grades they get? Can they inhibit themselves from, impulsive behavior or impatience or interrupting or those kinds of things? And that's a normative test. So you kind of look at how typical is this particular student for his grade level in doing these things. And what you find is that different kids have different profiles. For example, kids that are ADHD might have issues with the self-regulation. They might also have issues with the metacognitive planning organization piece. Kids who have emotional issues might have more difficulty with the self-regulation piece, but they might have the metacognitive piece. That type of thing. A lot of times you'll find that kids who have Asperger's or other autism spectrum types of things might have some really big issues with the cognitive flexibility, adaptability types of issues. Another issue for measuring executive functioning, and this is more by giving particular tasks. One example is the Dielis-Kaplan Executive Function System, which gives several different types of neuropsychological tests. They're all different, but they've all been co-normed on the same population. It doesn't give you one big summary score, but you get to see how kids do on a variety of different tasks. A lot of them have to do with flexible thinking, being able to mentally shift gears, to inhibit overlearned responses, to think abstractly, all of those types of things. And here's an example of the type of task that might be on the Dielis-Kaplan. This is called a color word interference test. So what you have here is you have words that are printed, but they're printed, if you look down here, the words are printed in a color ink that's different from the name of the word. So the word blue is printed in green ink, the word purple is printed in red ink. So the task is to go through and to name the color but not to read the word, and to do this as fast as you can. So you time them, you look at the mistakes they make, whether they correct their mistakes or not, and this is a test of can you inhibit an overlearned response? Can you shift gears? Can you sort of maintain focus on one particular task and not have interference from, just your usual accustomed way of doing things? And so that will give you an overview of several different types of tests that are used in educational settings. Now, this is the end of this lecture.